I was realizing today that it's been perhaps just about over a year that I've had this sort of opportunity to talk about artworks with a group like this. Um, so, for one, apologies if I'm a bit rusty and awkward in this virtual space. But secondly, and most importantly, thank you all for being here and for this opportunity to um, talk about these great works with you and hopefully to have a little discussion about them afterwards. Britt, if you could just move to the next slide. So I'll just jump right in. So these two images were both included in the exhibition, Finding Meaning. The one on the left is by the photographer Mihoko Yamagata, while the image on the right is by photographer and activist Weil. And I was initially attracted to both of these photographs because of their very explicit focus on the medical and consequent implicit focus on illness. As you can see, Yamagata's image shows an older woman in a hospital bed, while Weil's image shows a woman wearing a hospital gown and holding a vial and a syringe. While my sort of initial attraction to them in relation to this pandemic moment was a little bit superficial, I've really come to understand both of these images much more deeply through the lens of the pandemic as it sort of continues to drag on, as well as in the context of the many upheavals and dramas that we have all collectively been through in this past year. Because really, more than just simple images of illness or of the medical, they're also, in many ways, meditations on loss and longing, as well as on desire and death, which I think are subjects that, rather unfortunately, have become pretty salient this year, have been brought to the fore as we all collectively experience various anxieties about illness, like fear of interaction with the world as we once knew it. And so what I would like to do is to contextualize both of these images in the context of the larger series that they're drawn from. In the case of the Yamagata image, it's drawn from a series called Kaiso, or alternatively titled Reminiscences, a memoir, while the Weil image is drawn from an extensive project that he undertook called the AIDS Photographs. While there's much to analyze in both images alone, I think the context is pretty significant, and so I'm just going to try to briefly run through the larger bodies of work. Britt, so if we could move on to the next slide, please. So Yamagata's project, Kaiso, was undertaken by the photographer in the early 1980s in response to her grandmother's declining health. She relocated to the United States in the 1970s to study photography, but returned to Japan to undertake this project. And one of the things that I find really most interesting or important about this project is that it was realized in collaboration effectively with her ailing grandmother, Aiko Yamagata. So each image in the series is paired with a text that is taken from extensive oral history interviews that Yamagata conducted with her grandmother. As you see here, image at left, and they each have this sort of panel of texts that came in a portfolio. And the texts are these fragmentary recollections of Aiko's long life, and the portfolio starts with Aiko's earliest memories and concludes seemingly in the moment in which the interviews themselves were conducted. And this particular pair is a pair that opens the series, and in it we see Aiko sat before a window, sort of looking a bit lost in thought. And the text that you see at right recounts one of her earliest memories. And this particular text, I think, is in many ways really characteristic of the text in the series at large, and its description of a life of both luxury and privilege, but also a life that was marked in many ways by both bouts of profound isolation, but also individual and collective traumas. And so in this text in particular, she describes the isolation brought upon her as a young girl by, in my reading, her family's sort of elite social status. At the time she was living with her grandfather, who was her caretaker then, but because of her grandfather's sort of many business and political positions, he was really rarely home, leaving her alone for the majority of her young life. And when he was home, his sort of business and political engagements followed him into this domestic sphere. And unfortunately, she was unable to engage with him even then and there because of her own position as a young girl. And so while most of the images in Kaiso are sort of loosely paired with their accompanying text, like this pair here, some have more direct relationships. And if we can move to the next slide, I'll speak about one of those. Take a drink of water. So this image is one of few that really explicitly relates to the corresponding text. And so you'll see at left here, we see what I believe to be Aiko Yamagata's hands holding a small light brown box in which there is a burnt silver watch. And we learn, courtesy of the text that the image is paired with, that this watch belonged to her late husband. And I'll read some excerpts of the text here. So the text relates a story from her husband's late life. And that is, after his first day at Naval College in Tokyo, he boarded a train to return home, but only a few minutes later, he felt a sudden tremor of the earth and the train stopped. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 had struck. And so with the train unable to move and knowing that his sister was alone at home in Kamakura, which is about 30 miles outside of Tokyo, he walked through the night, arriving home the next morning, only to find that the house had burnt to the ground overnight. And the text goes on to tell us, while searching for his sister's remains in the debris, he learned from a delivery boy that his sister was safe. In the meantime, however, as he had been combing through the debris, he found a silver watch that had been a gift from the emperor for finishing class as an honor student. And the watch's hands had, I think, quite profoundly stopped and melted not long after the earthquake had struck. And so, like so much of what Yamagata's grandmother relates, there's really this interesting interconnection between triumph and trauma. The two are really inextricably intertwined. It's worth noting, for a bit of context, that the Great Kanto earthquake was really this pivotal moment in modern Japanese history in which some half of the homes in Tokyo were destroyed either through structure collapse or the following fires, and some 150,000 people lost their lives. So it's this really immense, epical, like, national trauma. And so the watch simultaneously becomes a symbol of that moment, while also still in many ways retaining its initial significance as a marker of the success of Aiko Yamagata's husband. And then there's sort of this third component where in the hands of Aiko Yamagata late in her life, it's also a sort of memento of her late husband. Would you move to the next slide, Britt, please? So not terribly long after the immense devastation of the Great Kanto earthquake, and before Japan could really sort of steady itself from the losses that it incurred because of it, Japan enters World War II. And with her husband being in the Navy, this had special significance for Aiko. And so in this image, which we began with, we see the text paired here, which relates an anecdote from a conversation with Aiko and a colleague, I suppose you could call him, of her husband, named Admiral Seiji Ito. And the text says, Admiral Seiichi Ito once said to me, "Mrs. Yamagata, this is a bad war. We need to have peace. I doubt that any of us will survive." And as with so many of her recollections, a premonition of sort leads to actualization, and the latter half of the text tells us that Admiral Ito and his son both died in the war. Elsewhere in the series, we later learn that her husband had also lost his life in the war. While flying back to Japan from a mission, after which he was to be appointed Undersecretary of the Navy, his plane was shot down by an American pilot over China. And having landed in China safely, we learn from a conversation between Aiko and one of the men in sort of the squad that her husband was in that had managed to escape safely, that in China, with enemy soldiers closing in on them, her husband committed ritual suicide. And with the loss of her husband, the responsibility to lead the family really fell squarely on Aiko's shoulders. And we learn elsewhere from the text that she met this challenge well, becoming sort of the sole head of the matriarch of a large, prosperous, and multi-generational family. And so this image then, and all of the other images contained within Kaiso, can really be understood as, in a sense, archival documents. They capture not only Aiko's memories, but also her likeness late in life. At the same time, and especially in this moment, I sort of also read them as a way of processing the fear and anxiety brought upon by Aiko's illness, experienced at the prospect of losing an individual that really was responsible for the family's entire identity and well-being. And Britt, would you move to the next slide, please? Britt, could you move to the next slide? Oh, there we go, thank you. It's a bit delayed. And so while Kaiso, Yamagata's project, focuses narrowly on the experiences of one individual's sort of struggles with illness and the consequences that they had for her family in particular, Brian Weil instead documents a collective trauma around illness, and that is the sort of experience of the global HIV/AIDS epidemic. And it's certainly worth noting that Weil's photography is really inextricable from and deeply shaped by his activism, or you could say they sort of were parallel and intertwined. And so in 1985, he began volunteering with a recently founded organization based in New York called Gay Men's Health Crisis. And this organization had been founded in response to a worrying prevalence that sort of began emerging in the very early 1980s of a especially pernicious type of cancer called Kaposi sarcoma among gay men in New York and San Francisco in particular. And I think rather interestingly, the name of this particular organization really shows the very narrow and murky understanding of HIV/AIDS as it was beginning to emerge, and unfortunately sort of sets a precedent in a way for the framing of the HIV/AIDS epidemic later into the 1980s and on. But more to the point, Weil's engagement with Gay Men's Health Crisis gave him opportunity to meet a wide range of individuals that were struggling with complications around HIV and AIDS. And it is through his work with this organization that he met many of his subjects, and in particular, the woman that I would like to talk about, Maria. And so Maria was an HIV positive woman, a graduate student from South America, who, when Weil met her, was 38 years old and had a 2-year-old HIV/AIDS positive daughter named Flavia. And because of restrictions around entry into the country for people that were HIV/AIDS positive at the time, she was separated from her husband and became the sole caretaker of her children while struggling, both with her own experience with AIDS and their experience with the disease. And very importantly, Weil photographed her over the course of several years, chronicling her life and all its mundanity, but also her struggle with AIDS in particular. So these two images, I mean, they show Maria living a very normal, very happy life with her two daughters. And I think it's really important to contrast them to so many of the images that were being made of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the United States at the time, when so many photographers were really focusing solely on people and sort of their last days and their worst state with their affliction. And Weil rather cast Maria not as an agentless victim of the disease, but someone who's living a complex and full life. In the words of the British art historian Simon Watney, they sort of work counter to what he described as the spectacle of AIDS, which is really precisely that sort of image that I'm talking about, where it's usually, most of the time, you know, a 20, 30-something-year-old white gay male who is extremely underweight, gaunt, covered in lesions, and really, no matter how well-intentioned those images may have been to call attention to the severity of the crisis, they also sort of functioned as a sort of symbolic violence that reduced a person's entire life and their struggle with HIV/AIDS to merely sort of a symbol of death or a specter of death. And Weil's images work as you know, they work counter to this. They challenge pervasive stereotypes of AIDS as a phenomenon that was only afflicting a very narrow segment of society, and show sort of a diversity of people that were impacted by AIDS. And in service of this, he also photographed internationally, sort of traveling the globe and photographing the experience of the HIV/AIDS crisis elsewhere. And so he really paints a more complex and ultimately more sympathetic picture, and one that I would say is also more politically useful and less reductive. Eli, would you move to the next slide? That said, Weil is really not trying to paint a false picture of HIV/AIDS, but rather a more complete one. And so he doesn't shy away from the bad by any means. And so here you see another two images of Maria, and the image at left is Maria at her first daughter Flavia's funeral, and the image at right, titled Maria and Adriana visiting the family grave, is, I can only assume, the two of them after the funeral coming back to visit the site where Flavia was buried. And then if you would move to the last slide. And then coming full circle to the first image that I showed you all, this is an image taken in 1990, so 5 years later, of Maria self-injecting experimental drugs. And I can only assume, although unfortunately without access to our archive, it's sort of hard to confirm for sure, that this is some sort of experimental antiretroviral or an earlier very experimental therapy to combat HIV/AIDS. And it really, you know, when I first saw it, it sort of reads as an image of someone that's at a loss, but coming to contextualize it within the larger body of Weil's work, I am now feeling like it is really rather an image of radical hope, in which there is, you know, a glimmer of possibility that AIDS is not, in fact, a death sentence, but something that can somehow be overcome. Which I think has a lot of resonances in many ways with the particular moment that we're living in right now, in which vaccines are just beginning to be rolled out, in which we're, you know, seeing the light at the end of the tunnel or at the beginning of an end. And so these are the many ways that these images resonated with me. And I'd love to hear how these images resonate with you. I would also like to acknowledge the fact that Mihoko Yamagata is here in the audience. And if you would like to counter anything I've said or add anything to what I've said, I would very much invite that.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. This was very interesting. And from the photographer's point of view, for my work, the image is taking place in a limited location, mostly in bed at home or at the hospital. But the story goes over 80 years of her life, which went through pre-war experience to the war to the post-war. And so it is a story of a woman's life in Japan during that time. And anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna hop in and I'll happily take over for Britt's role right now while she's trying to work out her issues. Her internet crashed apparently, so we all know that's a fun time. So we have a question in the chat from Brenda wanting to know, are these all images all from a book or a feature article? How were they shared with audiences at the time that they were made? So wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Is that, Brenda, are you asking about Mihoko Yamagata's images or Brian Weil's or both?
That's a great clarifying question.
I think you muted.
I was referring to the second body of work you were just talking about.
As far as I know, he did publish a small book in his lifetime with some of these photographs, but also exhibited extensively. And you know, we actually have Brian Weil's archive at the center, and I was just looking at the finding aid, and I don't know, feeling a bit crestfallen because there's really not a huge amount of information about him available either on the internet or through books. And I mean, for instance, I had come across mention of the fact that he really didn't want the images just to ever speak for themselves. So he would include like extensive sort of explanatory texts about what was happening in the image in his exhibitions. And unfortunately, those don't exist in our fine print catalog, but there is mention of them, of these like labels existing on the finding aid. And I feel like, you know, being able to spend time with that material would answer so many of these questions and add so much more depth. But in COVID world, unfortunately, it's inaccessible.
So this is another question we have in the chat. Wondering if you could talk a little bit about why the Weil images look the way they do, so much grain with highlights blown out. So I don't know if you'll have answers to that given what you just said, but if you do, a bit about that.
Well, I mean, for one, he would sometimes scratch or alter his negatives. He would intentionally develop them in ways that exaggerated the like grain quality. I've also read about him recording video on Super 8, which is a very small format film, and then projecting and rephotographing with like still 35mm film those images. And so in all of these various ways, he's sort of exaggerating exactly those characteristics that Becky is talking about. And he stated during his lifetime that it was a means of I mean, giving a degree of like privacy and anonymity to the people that he was photographing. I can't help but think that in some ways it also sort of symbolically parallels the like deterioration that is happening with these people's own bodies. That is perhaps reading a bit into it theoretically.
Let's see what we've got here in the chat. Maybe you or Mihoko, thank you for being here, might comment on the decision to write the stories in text in addition to capturing the stories in the photographs.
Can I leave that to you, Mihoko?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning part.
Oh, sure, I'll repeat it. Could you comment on the decision to write the stories in text in addition to capturing them in photograph form?
I see. Well, my grandmother was a great storyteller, and I always loved to listen to her talk about her life and how the society was and her lifetime experiences and so forth. So I decided to record, and it was, for me, of course, it was my beloved grandmother, but at the same time, it was a story of a woman and history. And so I recorded, and then I made into a short text. And I wanted to photograph her, and she was, as you could tell, I guess the photo wasn't shown, but she was at times really kind of humorous. I had a good sense of humor, and I wanted to show her gesture, her relationship with us granddaughters. And so although, as I said before, the images are limited to the short amount of time and location, the text expand. And I just thought that they went together.
Thank you.
And may I just say one thing? It was my honor to have an exhibition at CCP in, let's see, 1989, I think. And the space that you exhibited my work, prior to my exhibition, there was a huge photograph of Richard Avedon's father. And it was such an honor. And I really appreciated the timing and so forth. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being here. It's really such a treat to have one of the artists that, we're here talking about. We really are so grateful that you're here. And Adam, thank you so much for sharing your insights with these two really astounding photographs. And unfortunately, we are kind of running short on some time here. We want to let everybody get going. So if you do have any follow-up questions, though, I know we didn't have time to get to everything. Please, feel free to email us other questions and we'll follow up with you. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for your insights, Adam. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening. We hope to see you all again at the next month's Curators Corner on March 18th at 5 p.m. with CCP Chief Curator, Dr. Rebecca Sempf. And so have a wonderful week and take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everybody. It was great to see you all.